is, of course, because of its size and because of the large places where ranches could live, would attract the Portuguese who had a love of the outdoors and work with animals, you might say, either dairies or how to raise cattle, the Parker Ranch, for instance. And they also tended to be in places where there was a Catholic church, because the Portuguese were usually religious, centered about family and work with nature. So I would say that places like Honoka'a and Hilo would be important, Camuela, for the Portuguese who would go to Hawaii usually after having spent maybe a little time on other islands. There was some tendency for Portuguese to be found in one island and then members of the family go to another island. So the Kamehameha, the king, first spent part of his time largely on the Big Island or Oahu. So there are stories of Kamehameha with the early Portuguese. And of course he died in the early 19th century, but he had united the kingdom before the arrival of the Portuguese. So I would say those places, that type of work with also the sea and so on. Now, I think I've said enough to orient you about the Big Island Portuguese in their origins. Of course now, with modern planes and so forth, the Portuguese are widely scattered.
My name is Milo and Dolores Botelho Ferreira. I'm usually just called Milo, and it's M-I-L-O. I was born in Papaloa, which is 20 miles south on the Hamakua coast. And I was raised here in Honoka'a, and I've lived here for the past almost 60 years. Born and raised right here. On the Botelho side, my great-grandfather came over when he was in his late 20s. And it was a thing where he was a lawyer this is my grandfather Botelho, and he was a lawyer in Madeira. And when he came, why he came over was his sister was coming over, and he was before the judge trying a case, and the judge got him angry and he threw the book at the judge. So he left Portugal in a hurry. He was single at the time and he came. So that he's our black sheep of the family. We still don't know where he is once he died. He came here, he lived here all his life, but we don't know where he's buried. We have not been able to find his death certificate or anything else. So I have a cousin in Hilo that always says that he ran away. We don't know where he is. He took off. On my grandmother's side, on the Botelho side, I'm Branco. And they came over and landed in Lapa Hoihoi. And my great-grandfather... Where is this? Oh, Lapa Hoihoi is about halfway between Hilo and Honoka'a on the Hamakua coast on the Big Island. And he ran a store for years and years down there. He was the only shopkeeper there. And they were supposedly well-to-do with that day and age. And when they were cleaning up after the tidal wave, they found little bottles. And one of my dad's sisters asked, "What are these bottles from?" And they used to bring in opium from China and sell opium. In those days, it was legal to sell opium. And they did it in the store. I mean, so it was just another commodity that they sold in the store. So he's a black sheep on the Branco side of the family. Just let it all out and let everybody know who the black sheep are. On my mom's side, I'm Cipriano and Marx. And my grandfather Mark's, this family came over, and they were, actually my grandfather came over when he was I think he was, what did she say? I think he was about 16. He was already working when he came over, and he came over as a carpenter. My grandmother, Cipriano, was just 4 years old when they came over, and this was in 1864, I think it was, when they came over.
And you remember the boats?
One of them came over, I think my grandmother Mark's Cipriano came over on the Suffolk, but that's the only boat that I remember. Well, I make, once in a blue moon, I'll make my grandmother's malasadas and her sweet bread. And I do the turismas at Christmas time. And I make what's called, I can't say it, my Portuguese intonation is terrible, arroz doce or something like that. It's hard rice, translated to hard rice. That's what we call it, hard rice. And my grandmother used to make that all the time. I can remember going up to her house and having that, and that was a big treat for us when she did that. And so things like that. And when we were kids, my grandparents used to speak Portuguese at home, but it was a thing where they didn't want us to know what they were talking about, so they spoke in Portuguese, so we couldn't understand them. And so lots of it was lost. We were never taught Portuguese. I picked up words here and there, but, you know, it was like my dad would say, go get the bolachas and the manteiga, you know. And so after a little while, you realize that that's a crackers and butter, you know. So it was just, that's how I picked up the words that I do know. And I can't put two words together and make sentences. I can't do that. And that's always been a thing where I felt real bad about, you know, because there was nobody to teach us. Okay, you start with a little oil in your pot, and you put in some, you fry brown some onion and potato and carrot, and then you add, oh gads, I can't remember off the top of my head. I know it's rice, and you add some kidney beans and tomato sauce, and then the seasoning, salt and pepper, and a little of my grandma's homemade allspice. And you just cook it until the rice is done, and then pat it into a pan and stick it in the refrigerator to harden. And then when you want to eat some, you cut it and you fry it, and it's out of this world. So that's what I do. And I also make my grandma's allspice. It's different spices that she would put together and make her own. So, and that's most of my soups and when I make my vineyard oils and stuff, I season it with that. What I do with the Portuguese heritage. Well, I still put up my creche every year at Christmas time. And like I said, we always have terjmas and sweetbread after midnight mass. We never forget that.
You said before, what is that? Tresmas?
Yeah, it's like the vineyard oils.
Okay.
But you don't eat it before mass, you eat it after midnight mass. So you always have to go home and have that in sweetbread after midnight mass. And this is something we grew up doing. After mass, we would go to our cousin's house and have that. And then after she left, we'd go to other places, either the Andrades, or we had it at our house a couple times and all of this. And you also have soup. So it's one of the traditions too. So I don't know what else.
But aren't you involved with the Portuguese?
Oh yeah. I'm involved. I'm president of the Portuguese Heritage Council, Portuguese Heritage Club out here in Hamakua. I'm serving my second term, and we started this 4 years ago, so we're in our 5th year, and we're trying to get things back. But it's hard.
What is the main mission of the club?
To perpetuate the Portuguese heritage and try to bring back some things that are lost. And like we have a dancing group, and we're going to start this year with language lessons so that we can at least converse a little bit, you know, so we can learn more words. That with me, and I'm pretty sure that's all I'll be able to do. So we've been working with that pretty closely. And we do put out scholarships every year. And the thing that one of the requirements is that they go back and they trace their history back to Portugal. And so we're having them do genealogy so that they can qualify for the scholarship. Because here in Hawaii, we're such a mixed breed that it's really hard to find pure-blooded people anymore. So it's really hard. I think my kids and my nephews are the last pure Portuguese people around. Really, I do. And
So you are pure Portuguese?
I'm pure Portuguese, yes. And my husband is too. And so our kids, and they're in their 30s already. And then my nephews are in their late 20s. And I think they're the last pure kids around.
My name is Robert William Perreira, born October 4th, 1920 in Hilo. I'm a second generation Portuguese. My grandparents came from Ribeirão Grande in San Miguel. They came over on the ship Hankow in 1884. The ship carried about approximately 1,400 passengers. My grandfather came along with his wife and a boy and a girl, and one of the boys were born on the ship. And then he ended up with 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. My father was born in, and mom, they were both born in Hilo, Hawaii. Seemed to have a lot of money, and he was, I would say, a bootlegger in a way, because he had a big vineyard and he made wine, and that was his more or less hobby. And in those days there was prohibition in Hawaii, and the Navy ships used to come in at the harbor there, and my uncle had some kind of connection, and they would drive up along, and he had his wine in a cave wrapped with newspaper, and they would sell for $1 a bottle. But being a young guy, my brother and I, we didn't know too much about it, although we did help him. I came from a family of 9, 5 girls and 4 boys. And we all went to, at that time, there was called a boys' school and a girls' school. A boys' school was called St. Mary's. And we didn't go, there was no kindergarten or preschool. So we started off as first grade. But they didn't take you in unless you're 6 or 7. So I graduated from St. Mary's, 10th grade. It was all brothers. And then I had to transfer to Hilo High because it was all they had to, 10. So I went to Hilo High and completed 12th grade there. Then after, during the summertime, I worked for the plantation for $1 a day with a hoe, stuff like that. And one summer I went to the island of Lanai to pick pineapple. And there was about $2.80 a day. But the difference is you had to pay $1.50 for your lodging. And that's how I kept going. That's during school time. Now after school I wanted to go to university, but there was no university on this island. There were only 4 high schools, which today you have about at least 15 high schools. So I said, well, I better go to work and see if I can find something, and what I can do, and maybe later on I'll continue. But I said, okay. So I looked around for a job, and I got a job at the Flint Coat Company where they made board paper for ceilings. And I worked for them for about a year, but I was still looking because I didn't like the job. It was kind of day and night kind of thing. And being a young guy, I would play at night, of course, going to dances. So there was a job opening at the phone company, and I decided to try there. And of course, they gave me the same pay with the idea that every 6 months I would get an equal raise until I got to at least 50 cents an hour. So that's where I started from there. Then, of course, as you all know, World War II came along, and of course my number came up. And I said, well, I'll see what I can do. So after working for the phone company for a couple of years, I got drafted. The phone company wanted to defer me, but I refused to defer me because my older brother had already left. I was at number 2, and there was a number 3. So I said, well, I'll go. So I ended up in Schofield Barracks for a few days, and then we boarded a ship and headed for San Francisco. In San Francisco, they subbed us to Angel Island. It's a little island across Alcatraz. And there they gave us all kind of tips, plus haircut, clothes, and everything else. Then they split us all up, and I ended up with a bunch of guys that were in the ROTC. And I know I didn't belong there, but something must have gone with the TIS. So we ended up in Camp Fannin, Texas for basic training. And as you know, we didn't know too much about the mainland and stuff like that. After training, I was supposed to report to Fort Meade, Maryland. And I stayed there for a couple weeks before going to New York for my shipment overseas. I ended up in France, and there in what you call a replacement depot, where they pick you up and go to different divisions and stuff like that. I ended up with the Big Red 1, which is the 1st Infantry Division. And like anything else, we saw combat in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. And by the end, when it was getting close to the end of the war, we're getting close to Nuremberg, and I stayed there for some time for the Nuremberg trials. Of course, at that time, well, as you know, in war, you always have a replacement. I ended up as Sergeant First Class, and they told me that I might be going to Japan. But in a few months, they threw the atomic bomb, and that was the end of that portion. So we stayed for a while until we got back. We started to come back in 46. In 46, I came back to Hilo. Of course, I was a little shell shock. And we got to, all by boat, by the way. There's nothing, airplane, nothing like that. By the way, going from New York to France took us about 14 days on a boat because we're all stacked high. And that's the only way we could go. And when we came back, well, we ended up in Schofield again. And the officer told us, there are too many troops, so you can't come back to Hilo. So we'll give you a 5-day pass. So they gave us a 5-day pass. Then we came back, and I came back and spent a couple days with my folks. Both my grandfather and my father worked hard, worked long hours. And my grandfather always told us, maybe someday you'll have a chance to go to Portugal. But you have to work to really, you just don't, everything's not free. You have to work for it. And that he kept reminding us all the time. Now my father, my brother and I got together, and we paid his trip to go to Portugal. And he came back and told us, you boys will have your chance someday, so don't forget to go. So back in the late 80s, while I studied a little bit about Portugal, and I went for 25 days, and I enjoyed it very much. Since they came from San Miguel, of course, we did go to mainland Portugal. We went to San Miguel, then also went to Madeira and Terceira. And everybody seemed to be working all the time, and no chance of, over here, it seems that the younger generation, as they go into school, they have to find some sports for them to play, because if they don't, they start getting into trouble. Maybe that's one of the reasons there's so much drugs today. And I don't know about Portugal being in drugs as far as that go, but I can tell you that's what used to happen. And we really, really enjoyed Portugal. I mean, I did, and that's why I recommend anybody who has a chance, a little money, go to Portugal and see what it's like over there. Where you saw young people working on buildings, doing concrete jobs. And what really surprised me in Portugal, some of those cathedrals they got over there. And you wondered, and you looked up in the air and you said, how did they get up there? And the tour guide would say, oh, they just made planks and kept on going. Well, today they don't do that anymore. They have all the machinery to take care of all those kind of things. Same with mixing your cement. They could make it by the tons.
I'm Piilani Chaves. I'm of Hawaiian, Chinese, Portuguese descent. I was born in Lapahoehoe, where my mother had a family home. They once lived in Hilo, but then they moved out to Lapahoehoe, where I was born.
Which is Big Island?
Yes, it's about 22 miles away from Hilo. My father worked for the railroad,
And
and
his name?
his name was William Viveras. Like all Portuguese, I guess they had two names, and he had two surnames. His name was William Moniz Viveras, and my mother was Mary Kau'i Akau. She was of Hawaiian Chinese ancestry, and my father was pure Portuguese. Well, as far as my father, we never knew too much about our Portuguese side of the family because I think at that time most Portuguese men just they got married, they just followed their wives and got to know their in-laws more than and we didn't get to know our Portuguese side of the family. It wasn't much later until I got married that my husband pointed out people in my family that he knew were related to me. And
So your husband is a Portuguese?
my husband's Portuguese Spanish. His mother came from Spain. And that's how I got to know more of my family. And I got to meet them and kind of know them a little bit more than when I was single. And then I used to help the Portuguese Culture Club because they wanted somebody to come and help them mix their dough and things like that. And this is I learned from another club that I belonged to, which was the YMI Club, and they were a young men's institute, but they all became old, and that young men's institute didn't apply. But we were the auxiliary of that club, and that is how I learned to make sweetbread, malasadas, and making things in quantity, whereas I used to make small. And so I learned to make the malasadas in big quantities. I will give you a recipe that calls for about 40 dozens of malasadas, and we start off with, we use the school cafeteria to do this, and so when we did by hand, we made only 5 pounds, but this is like a big batch, so we use an electric mixer. And we put our eggs in the mixer first, put your wet ingredients first in the mixer, and then we put our sugar and salt and our cream, and that has been warmed up, and the butter has been melted in the butter has been melted in the cream. Along the way, we have added, instead of putting fresh mashed potatoes, would you believe we use potato buds, and it does the same thing. To me, it just gives it a little bit more fluffy consistency.
But can you tell the recipe with measurements? And
Okay, 30 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of sugar, 3 pounds of margarine, 2/3 cups of salt, 3 cups of yeast, 12 dozen eggs, 5 cans of cream, and like I said, I have added 3 cups of potato buds that has been dissolved in the milk and the butter, margarine.
so out of all of that,
Out of all this, you get 40 to 45 dozens of malasadas.
But how you start now? What you do now? What is the first thing that you do?
Oh, we put the wet ingredients into the mixer. We mix up the eggs first, really, and then before we add our warmed up milk, we kind of add some of the flour so that it would not be too hot for the eggs, and then we'd add the rest of the ingredients with the rest of the milk and butter and potatoes that's been dissolved. But we add all the other ingredients along with it and just beat it up in the electric mixer.
So after everything is mixed, when you know that is the right moment to take it out?
Well, we kind of judge it as when it kind of whips around the hook of the mixer, but I said, I usually try to judge by the feel that it's not so sticky. When you grab the dough, it doesn't just all stick to your hands. It has a kind of, when I touch the dough, it doesn't stick all to my hands, like I said. So that's when I know it's the right consistency. And then we let it rise for about 2 hours. And then we kind of put it down again. And then the next time it rises, we're ready to cook. So we start like 3 o'clock in the morning, and then we don't start cooking till maybe about 8 o'clock. But we do make more than one of these batches. We make 4 or 5 batches. Sometimes for other events, like when we had the church event, which was a fundraiser too, we made like 18 of the same mixes. And so it's a lot of work. After we get through mixing the dough, we put it in big tubs and we let it sit for 2 hours, roughly about 2 hours. And then we pound it down. We use our hands to make the dough go down, and then we let it rise again. And when it rises again, then we're ready to cook. And we cook the dough in hot oil. That is about 325 degrees temperature. And after it's cooked, then it's rolled in sugar and it's ready to eat. I make 2 big pots of soup, sometimes 3 even, so I can't really say exactly. I would say maybe 20 pounds of ham hocks, and I'm really guessing, and maybe about 6 pounds of beans, dried red beans, and I never use canned beans for soup because it's not the same. And use Portuguese sausage, maybe about 12 Portuguese sausage. I don't know poundage-wise it is, but and I use cabbage and macaroni, potatoes and carrots. I would say carrots about 15 pounds and potatoes about 20 pounds of potatoes. And we use tomato sauce, like maybe 2 to 3 gallons of tomato sauce. I'll put even crushed tomatoes in it, maybe about a gallon or so of that. But the ham hocks are cooked. I usually cook them at home because it takes too long to take it to the cafeteria and cook it there, which is a certified kitchen. And I cook it at home. And then after we get there, then I have them kind of scrape off all the fat of it, and just we keep the skin because a lot of people here like the skin of the ham bones. And by doing that, it cuts a lot of time in preparation that we can be ready by 8 o'clock to serve the soup.
So you start also that process like at 3 in the morning? Or?
Yes, we start that at 3 in the morning too, so that by the time we're all done in the kitchen, everything just moves out of the kitchen and up to the park.